Next, the Happy Bottom Riding Club, the story of Pancho Barnes, a pioneering female aviator, barnstormer, cross-country flyer, and Hollywood stunt pilot. In 1929, she broke the women's speed record. She was also the proprietor of the Happy Bottom Riding Club, a ranch and nightclub in the Mojave Desert. Author and Professor Lauren Kessler talks about her biography of Pancho Barnes from the University Bookstore in Seattle, Washington.
Pancho Barnes was an amazing, albeit eccentric, woman. Born in Pasadena, Florence Lowe Barnes was the granddaughter of Thaddeus Lowe, who was a pioneering balloonist who flew in the Civil War. He actually went up and they charted where the Confederate Army was, and he saved the Union Army on several occasions, so he's quite the hero. When she was little, he told her she would be a pilot. She believed him and became one. She took to flying like a horse to water. It was where she felt most at home. She loved flying, everything from the planes to the pilots. The Happy Bottom Riding Club and Pancho became the headquarters of hotshot pilots, full of the right stuff. The pilots were Chuck Yeager, Tex Johnson, and Bill Bridgman. Outside of Muroc, Nevada, or Edwards Air Base, Pancho had a ranch loaded with liquor and food, and she hosted the parties of legend. Lauren Kessler captures the humor and charm of this wild woman who called herself the greatest conversation piece that ever existed. She writes with an intimacy that is poignant and exciting, an amazing feat as she never met Pancho. She writes the biography of Pancho Barnes that Pancho would have written, a tale of humor, naughty jokes, sexual and physical adventures, and of fortune and loss. I'm very happy to be here tonight. C-SPAN is also here tonight, taping for their book notes. Anybody would like to have a number, please see me afterwards. So, and Lauren will answer questions after the event. If you have a question, Mr. Dixon is here, and he will be coming to you with a microphone, so our audience at home can hear the question as well as our audience here. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Lauren Kessler.
Thank you all for coming. Actually, I wrote a better book than Pancho would have written about herself. She was not a very good writer. Among the many sources that I looked at to put together this book was about a 45 or 46-page, single-spaced, very badly typed, terribly ungrammatical beginning of a autobiography that she worked on. Pancho was great on starting things. She was always enthusiastic about something, and at one point in her life, she thought she'd be a writer. She wrote a story for Reader's Digest, which never got published, entitled How Reader's Digest Saved My Life, which I would think Reader's Digest would publish. And she started to write this autobiography. But I guarantee that she wasn't that great a writer. She was, however, a force of nature, I think, is what you'd have to say. She was a larger-than-life character who lived life the way she flew her planes, full throttle. I think she also lived life as if life had no consequences. And you can get away with that for a while, and she certainly did, but it does catch up to you at the end. So the story of Pancho Barnes is not just one rollicking tale of fun and good times. It's one rollicking tale of fun and good times where the good times bite you in the rear at the end. It's hard to figure out, in a way, what to read from the book because she lived such a very big life. You heard about her beginnings in Pasadena. She came from wealth on both sides of the family. And she was born into a kind of an upper crust debutante society that had certain expectations about the way she would act. And she defied all of those expectations. I think she was just born a rebel. I also think that her grandfather, Thaddeus Lowe, the most shot-at man in the Civil War, he was called, had something to do with it. I think the genes may have skipped a generation, but they went from grandfather to grandchild. She defied all of the Victorian childhood, the debutante Victorian wealthy childhood that she was supposed to be learning about, and her parents didn't know what to do with her. So they put her in a series, well, they put her in a boarding school, and then she got kicked out of one boarding school, and they put her in a slightly stricter boarding school, and then she got kicked out of that one, and they put her in a slightly stricter one, and finally they put her in a convent. She was going to get kicked out of that, but I think they made some major financial contribution to keep her in there until she was 18, and then very quickly found somebody to marry her off to. Like all of Pancho's 4 husbands, and most of the countless other men that she was involved in, both as lovers and as friends, the Reverend Barnes didn't know what hit him. Pancho is just a hurricane in many people's lives. So she was born Florence Lowe and became Pancho Barnes. She's known for being a pioneering aviator, a contemporary of Amelia Earhart, beat Amelia Earhart in the skies, was technically a much better pilot than Amelia Earhart, and flew faster. She was a barnstormer. She was a stunt pilot in Hollywood for Howard Hughes. She was also a script doctor for Erich von Stroheim. There was a period of time in the late 20s and in the middle and late 20s when Hollywood and aviation were both coming of age in Southern California, and she was really at the nexus of that. And that was only part of her life. As you know, she was a character in Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, and that's from later in her life when she moves to the Mojave. So I thought I'd read something from 3 parts of her life, small bits from 3 parts of her life. The first is when Pancho learns how to fly. And this is the, 1928 is the year. Excuse me.
In what year was she born?
1901. Aviators were drawn to Southern California with its open land and clear skies. So this is a long time ago. There, by the middle and late 1920s, dozens and dozens of little airfields were being carved from farmlands and orchards, with 1,000-foot dirt runways and shacks for hangars. Arcadia, Alhambra, Baldwin Park, Culver City, Crawford out in Venice, Rogers at Wilshire Boulevard in Fairfax. Imagine, a little airport at Wilshire Boulevard in Fairfax. Martin Brothers in Santa Ana, Metropolitan in Van Nuys, the biggest, 80 acres surrounded by chicken farms where the owner raised banana squash between the runways. Kids rode their bikes out to the airstrips after school to gawk at the World War I Jennies and the pilots in their greasy overalls hunkered down in the shade under the wings. Crowds came out on the weekends to see the pilots loop and spin and dive. Daredevils and would-be record breakers came from all over the country to fly the skies of Southern California. In the spring of 1928, Pancho was ready for a new adventure. She had already been on several major adventures, more adventures by this time than probably most of us combined in this room. Well, I don't know you all that well, but let me say more adventure than I will ever have. In the spring of 1928, Pancho was ready for a new adventure. The Mexican trip had been wonderful, exciting, memorable. She continued to regale her friends with her tales of adventure, embroidering them in the telling, conscious of herself as the main character in a dramatic narrative she could shape and reshape. She started up her parties again in the newly redecorated San Marino mansion. She rode her horses, but she was bored. Her cousin, Dean Banks, had just started taking flying lessons at an old balloon field in nearby Arcadia and asked if she wanted to come along. Equally interested in new adventures and in not allowing Dean to get too much ahead of her in anything, she readily agreed. Although she'd not considered the idea of taking flying lessons before that moment, now, suddenly, it seemed like the very best idea in the world. The airfield wasn't much, a narrow dirt strip with 2 ancient cavernous balloon hangars, a mooring mast, and a few pilots tending to World War I vintage planes. Dean introduced her to Ben Caitlin, his teacher, who had learned to fly in France during the war. He stared at her. Her hair was still cut short, as it had been in Mexico, and she was wearing old riding clothes. Her arms and shoulders were hard and visibly muscled, like a man's. "So you want to learn how to fly?" he said. He made his living giving flying lessons, but women were not his favorite pupils. "Yes," she said. "Now, when is it you'd like to start learning?" he asked. Pancho didn't hesitate. "Right now is okay." Caitlin reached into the front cockpit of one of the planes, grabbed a leather helmet and a pair of goggles, and tossed them to her. Moments later, they were airborne. Pancho strapped in the front, Caitlin in the controls and back. She liked the fast taxi down the dirt strip, dust flying everywhere, and she liked suddenly, effortlessly, being lifted above it all, the engine loud in her ears, the wind whipping at her face. But before she had a chance to feel airborne, they were down again, and Ben was jumping out of the cockpit. They agreed to another longer flight the next day. The morning was bright and clear. Ben took the little plane up to 1,000 feet, then banked it sharply to the right, dipping the wing straight down. The horizon disappeared. The earth tilted to meet them. Pancho felt her body being pulled, its weight straining against the seat straps. Ben straightened their course, but before Pancho could get her bearings, he pointed the nose up and looped the plane in a long, slow outside circle, turning the world upside down. They flew belly up for a long moment. When they were right side up again, Ben rolled the plane wing over wing, first to the right, then to the left, until Pancho didn't know what was earth and what was sky. He climbed again, put the plane into a stall, and spun it straight down in a tight spiral. The earth came at them, spinning like a platter. In a few hundred feet, the nose of the plane would bore a hole in the ground. At what looked like the very last moment, Ben pulled out of it, straightened out, and landed on the little airstrip. When they taxied to a stop, he yelled up at her, grinning, "Still want to learn how to fly?" He had, in aviation parlance, wrung her out good. He expected to see her pale and shaken, queasy, finished with flying. But there she sat, grinning back, her face flushed, her eyes a little wild, riding the last wave of an adrenaline rush so exquisite that it was almost painful to feel it ebb away. "Hell yes, I want to learn how to fly," she told him. She probably didn't say hell. She probably said something else. He shook his head, trying to figure her out. "I suppose I'll have to teach you," he said, "but I have to tell you, I've had 33 women students, and not one of them has soloed." Pancho came back to the airfield several times a week from then on. Ben charged her $5 for a 15-minute lesson. They wore no parachutes because Ben couldn't afford them. In the cockpit, there wasn't much to learn. The only instrument was an oil gauge. Pilots looked over the side to judge altitude. They dipped a string in the gas tank to gauge fuel level. They hung a keychain from the control board to show them if they were flying straight. In the cockpit, life was simple: stick and rudder, up and back, left and right. The planes stayed in the air when they stayed in the air by quick thinking and guts. Flying was 85% man and 15% machine. That's what Ben told her. He started by teaching Pancho how to fly straight and level, pointing to a road below so she could orient herself. It didn't take her long to catch on, tracing the road from above, holding the nose level by gauging the horizon line and keeping her eye on the keychain. Next, he started her on turns, then figure eights. Each day was a new challenge, each day another thrill. Ben had never had a female student so quick to learn and so fearless, so eager, so filled with pleasure in the act of flying. When the lesson was over, Ben would take the plane up around 1,200 feet and perform aerobatics. Wing-overs, loops, barrel rolls, slip, stalls, and spins. He wasn't trying to scare her anymore. He was just having fun. He was also showing her how it felt when an engine stalled out, which happened often in those tiny planes, and what to do when the ship started spinning. One evening at dusk, they were flying back in after another lesson when, with Ben at the controls, the plane went into a dizzying spin and came down to within 50 feet of the ground before Ben pulled it out and landed. As soon as they stopped taxiing, he jumped out of the cockpit and leaned against the side of the plane. Pancho joined him. "Well, Ben," she said, "I've got to the point where nothing worries me anymore." She laughed. "You were pretty low that time, but you know, I'm just so used to these maneuvers that I never get scared." Ben didn't say anything. So she looked at him more closely. His breathing was quick and shallow. "We damn near got it," he said. "The rudder stuck and I kicked it and fought it all the way down. I just kicked it hard enough and got it loose. We almost spun in." Pilots always talked about spinning in, never about crashing. After that, Ben didn't spin anymore, no more aerobatics. A few days later, the owner of the airplane they were using, a man named Jimmy Rosen, spun in. The ship was demolished, and Jimmy was killed instantly. A while later, another flyer crashed into the old balloon mooring mast. His plane ricocheted and bounced onto Pacific Electric railroad tracks that bordered the airfield, cutting down 28 power poles along the way. He walked away from that. Crashes were commonplace, although it was equally commonplace for a pilot to walk away unhurt. The planes flew only 90 miles an hour, so often less, and were easy to jump clear of. The dirt runways and pasture lands where the pilots set down were forgiving. Ben told Pancho that she would have to make 6 perfect landings in a row before he allowed her to take the ship up alone. This was after about 6 hours of instruction. Day after day, she drove out to Baldwin Park to practice her 3-point landings. The airfield there was a little longer than Arcadia's, with fewer hazards and less crosswind. That made landing easier, but it was still the hardest part of learning to fly. She kept at it. Finally, one afternoon in early September, she taxied back to the hangar after her 6th perfect landing. Ben climbed out of the ship and told her to take it up by herself. She opened the throttle and roared down the field before he could change his mind. The little plane lifted into the air so quickly that it surprised her. Without Ben's weight, the plane soared. She sat in the open cockpit, caught in the moment, completely focused. She scanned the horizon. She looked earthward. She checked the keychain hanging from the controls. She pulled back slightly on the stick. Then she stopped thinking and started flying. She climbed to 1,000 feet and circled the field a few times, then brought it in for a good landing. She had been airborne alone for 5 minutes. She was a pilot. Ben barely had time to congratulate her before she took off again, this time with her first passenger, a childhood friend named Nels Griffith. The excitement of being up with a new pilot was not enough for him. They were all daredevils. They were all invincible. "Hey, let's show him something," he yelled at Pancho when they had flown around a few minutes. "I'll wing walk. You bring it down around the field below." Nels inched out of the passenger cockpit and stepped out onto the wing, crouching, holding the flying wires with both hands. Pancho, grinning, flew the plane 50 feet above the field, made a pass, then zoomed up and came around again with Nels still clutching the wires. When she'd unloaded Nels, it was Dean's turn for a run. Pancho didn't want the afternoon to end. Up above the earth in the pilot's seat, she was herself. No apologies, no compromises, no holding back. This was an adventure of her own making, and she could have it any day she wanted. The German flyer, Thea Rausch, a contemporary of Pancho's, said that flying was more thrilling than love for a man and far less dangerous. For Pancho, the thrill was more visceral. Flying, she told her friends, makes me feel like a sex maniac in a whorehouse. In about 1933 or so, Pancho had gone through 2 fortunes. And people talk about losing money during the Depression, and she didn't lose the money, she spent the money. She didn't make in bad investments unless you consider a line of thoroughbred horses bad investments. She had 2 mansions to keep up. She had parties that she hosted with food and drink and entertainment that literally lasted for weeks at a time. She had a string of horses. She had airplanes. She had fancy cars. And she wasn't making money in any way. She was just spending her inheritance. Somebody who reviewed this book said that Pancho Barnes only wanted one thing: more. And I think that's true. She wanted more airplanes, more horses, more men, and generally more fun. Well, in 1933, it was not possible for her to have more fun in the way that she had been having the previous, say, 10 years. She had to do something different. There was no money left. What she had in 1933 was a rather modest apartment building in Los Angeles. That was her very last piece of real estate. She had lost everything else, mortgaged it to go on an adventure. She traded that piece of real estate for 80 acres of an alfalfa farm in the middle of the Mojave Desert. It sounds like a very odd thing to do. She was a very odd woman. And I think she did it for a number of reasons. One would be that just because it was the Depression and she couldn't make a living doing anything else. But I think the desert for her was a blank slate. I mean, it literally is, even today, when you go out there, very undeveloped, literally a blank slate. She was a starter. She was somebody who wanted to make things happen. And this was a place maybe where she could make things happen. The Happy Bottom Riding Club really was slowly evolved from these 80 acres of an alfalfa ranch that she bought. Within a few years, and after a few more husbands, she had 360 acres, and she had a little airfield out there. She had a corral. She had 3-day rodeos, complete with Lady Godiva riders through the corrals. She had a big farm kitchen for all of the people that were her ranch hands and wranglers. And it was that kitchen that evolved into the Happy Bottom Riding Club. There were some men out in the Mojave that were on a Army Air Corps detachment, not very happy about it. There was no Edwards Air Force Base out there at all. There were like 6 tents, and that was it. And there was nothing to do. They'd come over to Pancho's and eat. And then more men came, and they would come over to Pancho's and eat. World War II, of course, Edwards Air Force Base grew to be enormous and was a staging area, training area for many of the pilots in World War II. And this little ranch kitchen became a restaurant, a bar and grill, illegal gambling, and maybe some other things that would serve the men out there in the desert. So the next reading that I want to do is just a little snippet about the Happy Bottom Riding Club to give you a sense of Pancho's style. And so we're skipping ahead quite a bit here. This is the 1940s. In the late 1940s, the Happy Bottom Riding Club was all action. Pancho bragged that she had a 3-ring circus going on, a real jumpin' joint, with big meals and lots of liquor and live dance bands 3 times a week. On Wednesday nights, the King's Four, a trumpet, sax, clarinet, and piano quartet from the base, played in the lounge. All the pilots and their wives came, the engineers, the designers, the crew. Anyone who had a membership card, she had to start making membership cards because there were so many folks that came out there. The crowd grew to as many as 400 people on these nights. But the real action was on the weekends when guests would fly in or drive in from Los Angeles. Her parties in the desert were just as legendary as her parties were in San Marino and Laguna Beach. Well, maybe more. At one New Year's Eve celebration, this is out in the desert, Pancho rode her horse into the lounge at midnight and shot off a gun. And actually, I think that would be just sort of standard operating procedure for her. Hardly worth mentioning. For another party, she imported 3 exotic dancers from Hollywood who performed, as Pancho said, a total striptease right down to their lovely naked bodies and not a goddamn thing wrong with it either. During the long, hot Saturday afternoons, it was common to see girls diving into the pool naked and men overcome with lust, alcohol, and high spirits splashing in after them, sometimes stripped to their underwear, other times fully clothed in suits and ties. She had a dug-in swimming pool in the middle of the Mojave, which was absolutely the talk of, I mean, people have talked about this from hundreds of miles away. She opened a motel, and the motel had the only air-conditioned rooms in the entire Mojave Desert. The bar at Pancho's was well stocked within its limits. If you wanted a drink, you got scotch, a highball or a beer. If anyone asked for anything else, a cocktail or something fancy, the bartender looked at him as if he'd gotten too much desert sun. There was no formality, no etiquette, no pretense. The bar, like Pancho, like the desert, was rough, coarse, and unceremonious. One night, a customer made the mistake of complaining when he saw the bartender stir his highball with an index finger. "Hey, buddy," the bartender replied brusquely, "the alcohol's going to kill the germs. What are you worried about?" The customer accepted the drink. So it's not a fancy place. Morals at the Happy Bottom Riding Club were always a matter of debate and continue to be a matter of debate right to this moment. After the war, when Pancho expanded her business and began catering to a larger and larger primarily male crowds, she started hiring pretty young hostesses to tend bar and wait tables, with the understanding that they would also converse and dance with the men. "My girls are the sugar to catch the boys," she would say. Pancho would advertise for hostesses in the Los Angeles papers. "Girls, vacation with pay on Dude Ranch," looking to attract personable, good-looking young women in their 20s. She was partial to girls who could sing or play the piano, who were outgoing, intelligent, and unabashedly flirtatious. I should say that these trips that she made into Los Angeles were really like casting calls. She'd put these ads out in the newspapers and then sit in her hotel room, and dozens and dozens of young women, out-of-work actresses or models who were between jobs, would come with their 8x10 glossies and interview for the job. She would not make the decision then. She would take the 8x10 glossies and bring them back to the Happy Bottom Riding Club, where she and Chuck Yeager and Jack Ridley and Bill Bridgman and any number of other of these hotshot jet jockeys that were hanging out at Pancho's almost full-time when they weren't flying, would discuss quite openly the various attributes of the hostesses, the would-be hostesses, and then they would choose. Let's take this one, let's take that one. All the hostesses worked at night, which was defined as late afternoon, when the serious drinking began in the lounge, to whenever the ongoing party broke up, often in the pre-dawn hours. Their days started slowly as they meandered into the ranch kitchen to drink coffee, eat steak and eggs, and gossip about the ever-changing who's who of guests. Some girls were off duty during the day. Pancho allowed them 4 days off a month, so much for the idea of the vacation in the Dude Ranch. And they swam or rode horses or caught up on their sleep. All she wanted was for the men to have a good time, a very good time. That often meant going out of her way to devise as outrageous and memorable an experience as she could. People came to Pancho's expecting wild times, and they rarely left disappointed. On one occasion, a couple of two-star generals called Pancho from their base in Ohio, telling her that they'd be flying out and were interested in the finest steak, some good scotch that wasn't one of your Mexican refills, and a couple of willing girls. I should tell you that I have it on the highest authority that Air Force brass routinely asked to be routed through Edwards Air Force Base. So they would have to fly, say, from New York to Cincinnati via Los Angeles so that they could hang out at Pancho's. Pancho met the challenge. She had 2 big aluminum serving trays made and commissioned a baker in town to create 2 giant loaves of bread. I don't know if you see where this is going yet. When the brass arrived, she served them big steak dinners, the best liquor, and told them the girls would join them directly. Back in the kitchen, the cook was busy making sandwiches with the loaves of bread, using 2 nude girls as the filling. A few ranch hands were called in to hoist the serving trays on their shoulders and present them to the astonished, delighted, and undoubtedly embarrassed generals who had gotten quite a bit more than they bargained for. Wild events like these, while they kept Pancho's guests coming back, also fueled the suspicion that something more than drinking, dancing, and clowning around was going on at the Happy Bottom. Locals were convinced, in fact, that the club was a house of ill repute, where Pancho's bevy of Hollywood hostesses regularly traded intimacies for cash. Everyone in the neighboring towns of Rosamond, Lancaster, and Palmdale knew, or thought they knew, the truth about Pancho's. Didn't all the girls go by fake names? They asked each other. Hadn't Pancho surnamed them all Smith, assigning days of the week or months of the year as their first names? And actually all the hostesses were January Smith and Wednesday Smith. They were all somebody Smith. The locals whispered about the prices each girl charged and made up stories about hand-painted signs nailed over the front doors of the cabins to advertise the favors that could be procured within. They whispered about a local lady who had stormed out to Pancho's to bring her daughter home. They whispered about how the principal of the on-base grade school walked toward Pancho's on Monday mornings carrying a stick with a nail in the end of it so she could pick up all the discarded condoms on the road before the kids saw them. Everyone had a story. The pretty wrangler who was hired to work with horses but supposedly asked to put in time at night in the cabins. The new hostess who it turned out had just been released from the Tehachapi prison for serving time for prostitution. Some said that when you rented a hotel room, a girl came with it. Others said you negotiated at the bar. Some said the services were open to everyone. Others said you had to be a friend of Pancho's. Local opinion was divided not on whether prostitution existed at the Happy Bottom, but only on whether Pancho encouraged it or merely tolerated its existence, whether she took a cut of the girls' earnings or was content that these extracurricular activities brought in more bar and grill customers. In private, Pancho, they said, made no bones about what was really going on out there. But to a man, the military pilots, most of whom had wives and children at the base, surprise, surprise, maintained the purity of the Happy Bottom Riding Club. Sure, it was raunchy at times, they said. Sure, there might be naked women in the swimming pool. But there was no sex for hire, they insisted. The pilots' wives thought they knew better. Glynis Yeager, Chuck's wife, called Pancho's little more than a desert whorehouse. She knew it, and so did I. The Happy Bottom Riding Club had a really good run for her money, for Pancho's money. She made quite a bit of money. She made and lost, I would say, quite a bit of money in the years that the Happy Bottom Riding Club was going full bore. She actually never really paid attention to what she was making. Sometimes she charged people, oftentimes she didn't. She paid people from crumpled bills in her pocket. She didn't have receipts. She never really knew, and I found out about this through court cases, she never really knew what was coming in and what was going out. All she knew is, did she have enough money to buy that beautiful horse? Did she have enough money to buy the plane she wanted and go to Mexico for 3 weeks? Well, the Happy Bottom Riding Club was located in between two dry lakes in the Mojave Desert. One of the dry lakes is actually the flattest place on Earth, the Guinness World Book of Records flattest place on Earth. And it's perfect, it's a perfect landing field. That's one of the reasons that Pancho moved there, and it's also one of the reasons that Edwards Air Force Base wanted her out. Edwards Air Force Base actually wanted everybody out. There was a small community of alfalfa ranchers, and they had some cattle out there, and there was a few towns. And when Edwards started to grow, they just wanted everybody out. They certainly didn't want Pancho there because Pancho had a civilian airfield. So now we're talking about supersonic testing of airplanes over the desert right next to a civilian airfield with people tooling around in their little recreational planes. So the government went around and made lowball offers to all of Pancho's neighbors, and they all said, okay, give me the money and we'll find someplace else to live. And then they came to Pancho, and guess what she said? Well, she said no. She probably said many other things before she said no. She turned around and sued the federal government 3 times, 3 different court cases, acting as her own attorney. The suits were all about trying to stay on the land. This was not just land, this was a way of life. This was something that she created from nothing. And she had a tremendous amount invested in it, and I don't mean money. As it turned out, she had to leave the land, and she had to leave that life. But she always had another plan, another thing she was going to do, more land she was going to develop into something else that was not Happy Bottom Riding Club, but something else. I don't want to give away too much of the book because, of course, I want you all to buy a copy. And by the way, all the good stuff is not any of the books that you might get from your local library. I've taken all of the good stuff out of them. So you actually have to purchase it. I hope there are no librarians in the audience. I don't think I'm giving away anything to say that Pancho died. She died in 1975, and the last bit of a reading that I would like to do is from is after her death. Pancho had been scheduled to be a guest of honor at the 5th annual Barnstormers reunion on April 5th, 1975. It was actually going to be a fundraiser for an aviation museum out in that part of the desert, and she was going to be the guest speaker. Now that banquet became Pancho's unofficial funeral service, with our old friend, Lieutenant General James H. Jimmy Doolittle, delivering the eulogy. Pancho, he said to the quiet and respectful crowd, had a heart as big as a ham. She put great store by courage, honor, and integrity. She was outspoken, and she said exactly what she thought and believed. Then Doolittle paused a moment. You know, he said, smiling, I can just see her up there in heaven this minute. She's probably remarking to some old and dear friend who preceded her, I wondered what that little old bald-headed bastard was going to say about me. The crowd laughed. That would be Pancho, all right. They could just hear her. Then everyone in the room stood for a toast. After the eulogy, the scheduled program dragged on, with a drunken stand-up comic from Las Vegas laying bombs. Ted Tate, the master of ceremonies, sat disconsolately, thinking about how different the event would have been had Pancho been there to tell her stories. Just let me mention that Ted Tate was one of 2 young men. He was in his late 20s or early 30s, young compared to Pancho, who was in her 70s at the time, who rediscovered her. She had been forgotten by everyone, and he was her escort to a number of these speeches and presentations. So he is the master of ceremonies for this particular one, but he had been with her for a number of them. Then Ted had an idea. He would do what Pancho was going to do without her, in honor of her. He stood at the podium, hands holding the rostrum, head bowed. Everyone quieted down, expecting another eulogy. As dramatically as he knew how, Ted told how Pancho had planned to tell the crowd a very special story that night. I know it's late, and we're all getting a little tired and a little drunk, but would you like to hear Pancho's story? The crowd roared yes. Then Ted launched into one of the filthiest, most profane stories in Pancho's repertoire. A story involving, you guessed it, naked women, peach ice cream, and words most of the men in the room had never uttered aloud. There was silence, then loud and nervous applause. In a tight knot, the directors of the new museum marched up to the podium and demanded Ted's resignation from the board. The morning after what he came to think of as this indiscretion, Ted called the commanding officer at Edwards, asking him for clearance to fly over the site of the Happy Bottom Riding Club. He and Billy, who was Pancho's only child and son, wanted to scatter Pancho's ashes there. That's what she'd said she'd wanted. The general, Bob Rushforth, gave the okay. But later in the day, one of the men involved in the museum project called the Los Angeles media and told them of the plans. Network reporters quickly descended on Edwards, asking permission to enter the old club site to take photographs. Rushworth called Ted in a huff. "I was going to let you do this as a personal favor," he told Ted, "but it's right in the path of our low-altitude flight test corridor, and you can't do it." Ted drove to the base and begged the general. "Okay," he finally said, "but just one pass." Billy fired up his little Cessna, and with Ted in the passenger seat, he flew out of Fox Airport in Lancaster. "Let's fly the old gal around the valley one last time," Billy said. And they did. Then they radioed the base for permission to make their one pass. They got it and began to bank into a turn. As Billy flew, Ted tried to get the top off the brass urn that held Pancho's ashes, but it was stuck. Billy kept circling while Ted struggled with the urn. Now Edwards was on the radio telling them that time was up and that they needed to get out of military airspace right away. "I can't read you," Ted said into the mouthpiece. Billy kept flying. From the side window, he saw the huge, flat expanse of the dry lake, the flattest place on Earth, disappear behind him. Directly below was what used to be the Happy Bottom Riding Club. He could make out the ruins, the four-tiered stone fountain that used to be in the motel courtyard, the remains of the corrals, the crumbling foundation of the old dairy building. The desert was reclaiming it. Finally, Ted got the top off the urn and slid the window open. Edwards was screaming at them to get out of there. He raised the urn and upturned it. The ashes were the same color as the desert floor. They fell slowly, like snowflakes. Then a crosswind caught them, and Ted and Billy watched as the remains of Pancho Barnes flew back through the Cessna's window and into the cockpit. You had to have the last word. And that's my last word. I would be happy to answer questions or sit down and be quiet. Either one. Yeah.
The film The Right Stuff, there's a scene in the desert. Was that intended to be a Pancho Barnes place?
Yeah, the question is about the one scene, really, that Pancho Barnes is in that I can remember from the film The Right Stuff that takes place out in the desert. And as I remember it, her desert place looks pretty ratty. It looks just like a shack, and it was certainly unpretentious, but it was not ratty. That was an important scene, or what happened, I suppose, right before that scene was the most important, and that was that Glynis and Chuck Yeager were riding Pancho's horses the night before, and it was a moonless night. And somebody closed the gate of the corral. They didn't know the gate was closed. And when the horses came at a full gallop into the corral, at least, I don't know what happened to Glynis, but Chuck fell off the horse and crashed into the corral and broke a couple of ribs. This was the night before he was to take the FX-1 up and try and break the sound barrier. And as the story goes, and most people know this story, he didn't go to the doctor on the base because he knew he'd be grounded, so he went to some doctor in Rosamond, tiny desert town, got himself wrapped, and flew and broke the sound barrier. So Pancho's became famous locally for the place where Chuck Yeager broke his ribs.
Were you able to interview Yeager?
I was not. No, I didn't interview Chuck Yeager. We had a correspondence by mail, and luckily for me, he wrote an autobiography with someone else. And he also sat for a number of oral history interviews, which are archived at Edwards Air Force Base in their history office. So there's a lot. He's on record a lot. Yeah.
How did you get interested in her?
I think there are a couple of answers to that. One is that as a writer, I'm attracted to I'm a nonfiction writer. So I'm attracted to real stories, and I'm attracted to stories of women who break stereotypes, who go through life at full tilt. The last book I wrote, which was not a biography, did have as its central character a woman like that. So in the back of my mind, I'm looking for somebody like that. I also knew about Pancho through The Right Stuff. But I think the key moment came when my father-in-law, who was stationed at Edwards Air Force Base in the early 1950s, and maintains, by the way, that he only had drinks at Pancho's. He was also married and had 2 children at the time. He started telling some tall tale about Pancho in a room. I wasn't even in the room. And my husband began to listen to this, and he said, "You got to come over here and listen to this." And I listened to it, and it was just one of these legendary stories. It turned out to be not true. He was just, one of these stories that people make up. But it got me interested enough so that I did a little bit more research. And it's hard not to fall into this story. Once you get a little piece of it, it's hard to let it go. Anyone else?
Are you a pilot?
Not only am I not a pilot, but I really hate to fly. I modify that by saying that I love to fly in little airplanes. I just don't like to fly in big airplanes. For this book, I have a friend, a good friend who is a pilot and is a instructor of pilots. She took me up a few times in her Cessna Skyhawk, and I really fell in love with flying in little planes. And she let me actually hold the controls, which was absolutely terrifying. And we also found a open cockpit, bi-wing open cockpit plane that I could at least look at, and is still not ready for anyone to fly in. But so I didn't come to this book out of a love of aviation. I came to it out of a fascination with the woman and a fascination with the time in which she lived. Yes?
I've always been a racing pilot enthusiast. Tell me, did Pancho ever participate in the powder puff derbies?
Yeah, she did. She participated in 3 of them. She didn't win any of them. And she participated in the very first one. And I'm blanking out what year it was. You probably would know this more than I would. But there were at that time, this is the late 20s, this is 1928, I believe, or 1929 perhaps. There were something like 3,000 licensed pilots in the United States, and about 30 of them were women. And 22 of those women were in the first Women's Air Derby. So pretty much almost Amelia Earhart, everybody who was anybody was in this. Pancho was doing pretty well. I should say that it went from Santa Monica, California to Cleveland, Ohio, and that's where the National Air Show was, in Cleveland, Ohio. And they flew only during the day, and they had to make numerous stops for gas, just the way you would in a car. They flew with Rand McNally maps on their laps. And they flew also when they needed to land, and a lot of these are dirt airstrips where they were landing to refuel. When they needed to land, there were no instruments, as I said before. There were no instruments to guide them, even for what direction the wind is coming in, and that would determine how you want to make your approach. So it was common procedure for them to take a plane, see some little town down there, take the plane down to about 50 feet, and see if they could find some clothes hanging on a clothesline. And that would tell them what direction the wind was going. If it was flapping real hard, then it was a hard wind. And at any rate, she was in 3rd place after either 3 or 4 days, and with plenty of time. It was an 8-day race, plenty of time to make it up, when she taxied onto a field, and a guy in a truck came right across this dirt field at the same time she was taxiing and broke off one of her wings. And the plane was irreparable on the field. It had to be taken by railroad car back to the factory. So she was out of that race. And neither of the other 2 races did she win. Yes?
What were her husbands like?
Shell-shocked. Well, her first husband was a fine and upstanding Episcopal minister. She was married off to him when she was 19 because he was supposed to calm her down. Didn't work. They actually stayed married on paper for quite a while, although they lived together as man and wife for maybe 2 years. Her second husband was a pilot, a would-be pilot. She was teaching him how to fly. This was out in the desert, so he was a student of hers. Her third husband was this absolutely gorgeous dancer who had, at that point in his career, he had a dance studio in one of the nicest hotels in downtown Philadelphia. He would teach ballroom dancing. But earlier in his career, with a series of gorgeous female partners, he performed. He performed on cruise ships, and he performed at the Palmer House in Chicago and the Top of the Mark and those kind of places. So that was number 3. And number 4,
where did she meet him?
some of her money came from, had a Philadelphia connection, and once a year she would go to a board meeting in Philadelphia, and he had a dance studio in the off the lobby of the hotel that her great-grandfather owned, or had owned. The fourth husband was a World War II pilot, not a combat pilot, but he flew brass around, he ferried brass around.
How many husbands did she have?
Just 4. She had other loves in her life. She was in love with Ramon Navarro, who was quite a heartthrob, a Hollywood heartthrob in his day. And she had John Wayne when he was still Marion Morrissey, was that his name? Morrison, thank you. And his dog, Duke, and that's how he got the name Duke, would camp out on her floor, and she kind of had a thing for him. I don't think it was reciprocal. But there were a lot of men in her life. She had enormous love, although not of the sexual nature, for Chuck Yeager. She thought of Chuck Yeager as her son. She was pretty terrible to her own son, and maybe that was psychologically some way of making it up, but they were very, very close for at least the few years that Chuck was out at Edwards. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Oh, now you get to buy books.
And Lauren will sign right here. I just need to move this podium. Whoops, thank you. Good catch. Oops. This is going to be a problem.
Lauren Kessler is the author of 9 books, including Stubborn Twig. She directs the graduate program in literary nonfiction at the University of Oregon in Eugene. Biography on Book TV can be seen twice.
Next, the Happy Bottom Riding Club, the story of Pancho Barnes, a pioneering female aviator, barnstormer, cross-country flyer, and Hollywood stunt pilot. In 1929, she broke the women's speed record. She was also the proprietor of the Happy Bottom Riding Club, a ranch and nightclub in the Mojave Desert. Author and Professor Lauren Kessler talks about her biography of Pancho Barnes from the University Bookstore in Seattle, Washington.
Pancho Barnes was an amazing, albeit eccentric, woman. Born in Pasadena, Florence Lowe Barnes was the granddaughter of Thaddeus Lowe, who was a pioneering balloonist who flew in the Civil War. He actually went up and they charted where the Confederate Army was, and he saved the Union Army on several occasions, so he's quite the hero. When she was little, he told her she would be a pilot. She believed him and became one. She took to flying like a horse to water. It was where she felt most at home. She loved flying, everything from the planes to the pilots. The Happy Bottom Riding Club and Pancho became the headquarters of hotshot pilots, full of the right stuff. The pilots were Chuck Yeager, Tex Johnson, and Bill Bridgman. Outside of Muroc, Nevada, or Edwards Air Base, Pancho had a ranch loaded with liquor and food, and she hosted the parties of legend. Lauren Kessler captures the humor and charm of this wild woman who called herself the greatest conversation piece that ever existed. She writes with an intimacy that is poignant and exciting, an amazing feat as she never met Pancho. She writes the biography of Pancho Barnes that Pancho would have written, a tale of humor, naughty jokes, sexual and physical adventures, and of fortune and loss. I'm very happy to be here tonight. C-SPAN is also here tonight, taping for their book notes. If anybody would like to have a number, please see me afterwards. So, and Lauren will answer questions after the event. If you have a question, Mr. Dixon is here, and he will be coming to you with a microphone, so our audience at home can hear the question as well as our audience here. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Lauren Kessler.
Thank you all for coming. Actually, I wrote a better book than Pancho would have written about herself. She was not a very good writer. Among the many sources that I looked at to put together this book was about a 45 or 46-page, single-spaced, very badly typed, terribly ungrammatical beginning of a autobiography that she worked on. Pancho was great on starting things. She was always enthusiastic about something, and at one point in her life, she thought she'd be a writer. She wrote a story for Reader's Digest, and she was really at the nexus of that. And that was only part of her life. As you know, she was a character in Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, and that's from later in her life when she moves to the Mojave. So I thought I'd read something from 3 parts of her life, small bits from 3 parts of her life. The first is when Pancho learns how to fly. And this is the, 1928 is the year. Excuse me.
In what year was she born?
1901. Aviators were drawn to Southern California with its open land and clear skies. So this is a long time ago. There, by the middle and late 1920s, dozens and dozens of little airfields were being carved from farmlands and orchards, with 1,000-foot dirt runways and shacks for hangars. Arcadia, Alhambra, Baldwin Park, Culver City, Crawford out in Venice, Rogers at Wilshire Boulevard in Fairfax. Imagine a little airport at Wilshire Boulevard in Fairfax. Martin Brothers in Santa Ana, Metropolitan in Van Nuys, the biggest, 80 acres surrounded by chicken farms where the owner raised banana squash between the runways. Kids rode their bikes out to the airstrips after school to gawk at the World War I Jennies and the pilots in their greasy overalls hunkered down in the shade under the wings. She defied all of the Victorian childhood, the debutante Victorian wealthy childhood that she was supposed to be learning about, and her parents didn't know what to do with her. So they put her in a series, well, they put her in a boarding school. And then she got kicked out of one boarding school, and they put her in a slightly stricter boarding school. And then she got kicked out of that one, and they put her in a slightly stricter one, and finally they put her in a convent. She was going to get kicked out of that, but I think they made some major financial contribution to keep her in there until she was 18, and then very quickly found somebody to marry her off to. Like all of Pancho's 4 husbands, and most of the countless other men that she was involved in, both as lovers and as friends, the Reverend Barnes didn't know what hit him. Pancho is just a hurricane in many people's lives. So she was born Florence Lowe and became Pancho Barnes. She's known for being a pioneering aviator, a contemporary of Amelia Earhart, beat Amelia Earhart in the skies, was technically a much better pilot than Amelia Earhart, and flew faster. She was a barnstormer. She was a stunt pilot in Hollywood for Howard Hughes. She was also a script doctor for Erich von Stroheim. There was a period of time in the late 20s and in the middle and late 20s when Hollywood and aviation were both coming of age in Southern California. Never got published, entitled How Reader's Digest Saved My Life, which I would think Reader's Digest would publish. And she started to write this autobiography, but I guarantee that she wasn't that great a writer. She was, however, a force of nature, I think, is what you'd have to say. She was a larger-than-life character who lived life the way she flew her planes, full throttle. I think she also lived life as if life had no consequences. And you can get away with that for a while, and she certainly did, but it does catch up to you at the end. So the story of Pancho Barnes is not just one rollicking tale of fun and good times. It's one rollicking tale of fun and good times where the good times bite you in the rear at the end. It's hard to figure out, in a way, what to read from the book because she lives such a very big life. You heard about her beginnings in Pasadena. She came from wealth on both sides of the family. And she was born into a kind of an upper crust debutante society that had certain expectations about the way she would act. And she defied all of those expectations. I think she was just born a rebel. I also think that her grandfather, Thaddeus Lowe, the most shot-at man in the Civil War, he was called, had something to do with it. I think the genes may have skipped a generation, but they went from grandfather to grandchild.